Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Well, tonight we're going to finish up Daniel chapter 11. And Daniel chapter 11 will finish up not only Antiochus Epiphanes, but it will also let us lay out how Antiochus Epiphanes is a picture or a precursor of the coming false Messiah. And again, this is probably the most interesting part of our study so far, and I'll probably say that again on account of as we build more and more information, as our base of reference grows, everything continues to, I believe, get more interesting. We left off at Daniel 11:29, and it's to me fascinating that Antiochus the Fourth, who we've been studying since verse 3 here in chapter 11, is added to his name the term Theos Epiphanes. Theos Epiphanes means God made manifest, because this is what he thought of himself. In history, he's really a very obscure leader on the world stage. Rome was in its ascendancy when he came on the scene. Antiochus had to do or respond to what Rome told him to do. He had to send taxes to Rome. He's pretty far up the food chain, but he's still not much more than just a glorified Roman tax collector. So then we have to ask the question, why does Antiochus Theos Epiphanes rate so much space in the book of truth? Everybody will remember that the book of truth, or writings of truth, we found in Daniel 10:21, is what's written down in heaven, and parts of this are given to us in our scriptures. We will again run into the book of truth as we're going along through this study on different occasions, not the least of which will be during the events of Revelation chapter 20, as the book of Revelation is beginning to wrap itself up. This man, Antiochus Epiphanes, is in this book of truth as a vile and despicable person, permanently determined as that sort of a person by the book of truth. And what's important, though, for us about Antiochus is that he is a strong type and foreshadow of the coming false Messiah. Scripture could have disposed of Antiochus in one verse. It did many very famous rulers. Just got rid of them in one verse. But Scripture gives Antiochus Epiphanes 14 verses. 14 verses from verse 21 through verse 35. And there's a reason for this. What he is describes what we have to be looking for in the coming false Messiah, who we are then told about immediately after Antiochus is given to us in this revelation to Daniel. That second part, the revelation about the false Messiah, starting in verse 36. So let's start off our charge through this evening by reading Daniel 11, verses 29 through 31. It says, At the time designated, he, that's Antiochus Epiphanes, will go back to the south, but this time things will turn out differently than before because the ships from Kittim is Rome, because the ships from Kittim will come against him so that his courage will fail him. Then in retreat, he will take furious action against the Holy Covenant, that's against God's people and the people under God's covenant, again showing favor to those who abandon the Holy Covenant. Armed forces will come at his order and profane the sanctuary and the fortress. They will abolish the daily burnt offering and set up the abomination that causes desolation. That last line is going to follow us for quite a while. In that verse 31, we're running into that phrase, the abomination that causes desolation. But if we go back from that, starting in verse 29, this is about another invasion of Egypt by Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus finds out that Ptolemy the Sixth and his brother Ptolemy the Seventh have formed a coalition to rule Egypt. Now, if we remember from last week, Antiochus had gone home, stopping to wreak a little havoc on Israel and Jerusalem, leaving Ptolemy the Sixth as a puppet on the throne, ruling part of Egypt against his brother Ptolemy the Seventh. Blood is thicker than water. The brothers Ptolemy get together because a united Egypt can then refuse to pay taxes to Antiochus, at least in their minds. Tax money that Antiochus probably needs to collect from them in order to pay off Rome. It's all about money. It always has been, always will be. So Antiochus invades Egypt again. This is 168 BCE. This invasion will prove not to be as successful as the last one. Ptolemy the Seventh is in Alexandria, and as Antiochus is besieging Alexandria, Rome sends an envoy to Antiochus about what he's doing. A man named Gaius Opilius Linnaeus, with a bunch of soldiers and 3 tri-team ships, come to Egypt. Rome sends this expeditionary force to Egypt to confront Antiochus. It's a force probably not large enough to defeat Antiochus on the ground there in Egypt with what he had brought, but it's a force big enough to send a message to him, and that's the purpose of it. What they're saying to him has to be taken seriously. Pay attention to this, because we can march the legions around the end of the ocean, around the end of the Mediterranean if we have to, and we're serious enough to do that if pushed. Antiochus, get yourself out of Egypt. It's ours. Now, these tri-team ships were impressive. They were 125 feet long. They had a beam of about 20 feet. There were 3 levels of oars came out of each side of this, with about 85 oarsmen propelling the ship when there was no wind at all. And they also carried a complement of about 200 men. Now, 3 of these ships show up, plus the land forces that they were carrying to confront Antiochus Epiphanes. That sends a little bit of a statement. Today, that would be like us sending in 3 cruisers, each of them carrying a large contingent of Marines, and saying, keep messing with us, we're going to come get you. Now, this Roman council, this Gaius Opilius Linnaeus, actually came up to Antiochus. This is a recorded fact in history. He came up to Antiochus, he drew a circle around Antiochus Epiphanes, and he told him that he had to have his decision made about staying in Egypt or leaving before he stepped out of that circle. See, Rome was not an easy dealing place to have. He could either deal with Rome and do what they said, or risk a war with Rome. And Rome was an emerging bully on the block. Rome was the emerging bully on the block. Antiochus left Egypt immediately, conceding Egypt to Rome, this setting up the stage for Antony and Cleopatra, and Caesar and Cleopatra, which made Elizabeth Taylor famous, as we well know. Antiochus left Egypt in a snit. He was all bent out of shape. He had the enormous war costs that he'd put into this, and nothing to show for it but humiliation. Man with that kind of bent pride would be extremely humiliated. He had an army with low morale that was muttering about what they were having to do. And this, of course, was bad news for Israel, because to get home, Antiochus had to cross Israel. And on his way across Israel, he stopped and he vented his wrath on Israel. He vented his wrath on those people who had been resisting him already, making him mad, because they had refused, and by and large, his efforts to Hellenize them, to turn them into good Greeks worshiping the false Greek gods. Remember that Antiochus has been working on this. He'd given special favors to Menelaus, the high priest. He started this whole procedure by murdering the legitimate high priest, whose name was Onesimus, and then put Jason in as high priest. And when Jason failed to live up to his expectations, he replaced Jason with Menelaus, who fulfilled the need that he wanted by forwarding sufficient amount of graft/taxes to Antiochus. Antiochus was giving special favors to Menelaus and the other apostate Jews who rejected the worship of the true God in favor of the Greek culture. Antiochus now, on this trip, ordered his generals to occupy Jerusalem with Syrian Greek troops. None of the ones that he would gather from various places to fight with him, but with Syrian Greek troops. And the purpose was they were to stamp out every trace of Judaism. That's what his orders to them were: stamp out every trace of Judaism, replacing it with Hellenism. And these troops stationed themselves in the temple and in the fortress that surrounded the temple. And all of this, if you want to do a little more reading, extracurricular, all of this is laid out for us in 2 Maccabees, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Now then an edict was made by Antiochus that all of the nations, all of the nationalities under his control, all the people in his kingdom, were to be fused into one people, one group, and all were to worship the Greek deities. The regular temple sacrifices were stopped. Syrian soldiers and prostitutes performed licentious heathen rites in the temple courts. Pigs were sacrificed to Greek gods on the temple altar, and Jews were required to take part in this. They couldn't just stand by and watch it or leave and go away. They rounded them up and forced them to come into this. These things that they were doing in the temple really amounted to drunken orgies in honor of the Greek god Bacchus. Bacchus, if you've never heard to him, was known in other places by other names, but he was the nature god of fruitfulness and vegetation. He was particularly known as the god of wine and ecstasy. And of course, nothing changes. We've still got that kind of nonsense going on. The Syrian Greeks introduced this kind of worship into the temple of God. And those Jews who tried to sacrifice to God, practice circumcision, observe the Sabbath, keep the feast, do things that God had ordained for them to do, were put to death. If a Torah was found, or any of the scriptures that could be part of Tanakh, the rest of the Old Testament, they were immediately destroyed, burned up, torn up. A pagan altar was erected over the altar of God, and the temple was rededicated to Zeus. And the statue of Zeus was put in place, some say with Antiochus's face on it, in place of Zeus. Remember, he thought he was God. And that really is a physical facilitation of the abomination that causes desolation, worship of the false gods. Let's take that abomination of desolation to Matthew 24:15, please. So when you see the abomination it causes, this is Yeshua speaking. So when you see the abomination it causes desolation, spoken about through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand the allusion. We're going to stop for a second right there. This is part of the Olivet discourse of Yeshua, which we're going to look at in real great detail as part of this study. What happened in Daniel 11:31 is ancient history. What's going to happen is alluded to by Yeshua here in Matthew 24:15. It's still in our future. What Antiochus IV Theos Epiphanes did in the past was set up the statue on the temple grounds, the abomination that causes desolation, foreshadowing what is going to happen in the future. And it says here, let the reader understand the allusion. Look where I'm pointing to. Look where I'm pointing to. All right, let's read this again and then continue on in verses 16 through 18. So when you see the abomination that causes devastation spoken about through the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand the allusion. That will be the time for those in Judah to escape to the hills. If someone is on the roof, he must not go down to gather his belongings from his house. If someone is in the field, he must not turn back to get his coat. In other words, when you see this happen, get out of town and do it quick. Do it quick, because things are going to begin to happen quickly. Yeshua here is talking about the end times. And that abomination that causes desolation, it'll be the same kind of desecration of the temple that took place historically during Antiochus Epiphanes' time. Taking this further forward, Daniel 11, verses 32 through 35. Those who act wickedly against the covenant, he, that is Antiochus, he will corrupt with his blandishments, but the people who know their God will stand firm and prevail. Those among the people who have discernment will cause the rest of the people to understand what is happening. Nevertheless, for a while they will fall victim to sword, fire, exile, and pillage. When they stumble, they will receive a little help, although many who join them will be insincere. Verse 35, then. Even some of those with discernment will stumble, so that some of them will be refined, purified and cleansed. Look at this. For an end time yet to come at the designated time. We're changing. From Antiochus Epiphanes, that's where we're beginning to switch over. We're beginning to move towards an end time yet to come at the designated time. We're beginning to move from Antiochus Epiphanes into the area of the false Messiah. Apostate Jews who had already desecrated or deserted the worship of God were flattered by Antiochus Epiphanes for the purpose of completely perverting their faith. Attaboy, attaboy, attaboy. Ultimately, though, his interest was to use them as part of the project to completely pervert the faith of all of Israel. Menelaus, the high priest, turned to the service of Zeus in the temple. That's what he was then leading instead of a service to God, because he was Antiochus's guy. But Jews who knew God took a strong stand for God and were obedient to God's covenant with Israel. We've got the Maccabees, for instance, which we're not really going to get into in this study, but Judas Maccabee and his father and his brothers basically went off and started a war against Antiochus Epiphanes. In verse 33, it is revealed that there was even some spiritual revival going on in this conflict. But many were also killed or imprisoned and their property confiscated. And the attempts by Antiochus to eradicate the faith really only caused spiritual purifying among those who knew their God. This verse 35, though, that's up here, is really the transitional phase from Antiochus Epiphanes to the time of the false Messiah. I'm going to read that again for you. Even some of those with discernment will stumble, There's time coming up when there's going to be people with discernment that are going to stumble. Yeshua talks about that broadly. We'll see that when we get to studying the Olivet Discourse. Even some of those with discernment will stumble, so that some of them will be refined. Some will follow on with God completely and be refined, purified and cleansed, but some will stumble. Those that will be refined, purified, and cleansed, though, will be those that are being prepared to go with the Lord at the end time, a time yet to come at the designated time. This purging of Antiochus, verse 35, really I believe is indicated to continue until the end time. That statement's very interesting. It's very clear from this reference that the persecution brought by Antiochus was not of the end time, but a like kind of persecution will be in place to the end. And Yeshua said, in this world you will have tribulation, be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. So this verse 35, again, harping on this, also serves as a transition for us to move us in this revelation of Daniel that we're studying from what is past to what is future. And this verse tells the reader that the prophecy now leaps ahead in time to the final pagan Gentile ruler before Messiah returns to rule the world. Points to God's judgment of the last Gentile generation to hold power. From this point on, though, in Daniel's prophecy, Daniel's prophecy is yet to be fulfilled. It's been fulfilled up until this point, historically. But from here on, it's yet to be fulfilled because we're not there yet. But we have really great confidence that it will be fulfilled, exactly as statement, because what has come before this has had its prophecies fulfilled. From verses 2 through 35, 135 prophetic statements have been fulfilled historically, completely and accurately. That's a wow. Giving us no reason to doubt the rest of this prophecy will be just as accurate. Now, starting from the time that we stopped talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, for the next 2,000 years, believers could read this and understand with complete confidence what was coming at the end. So Daniel 11, we're going to pick up in verse 36 now. We're looking off to the future. The king, that's the false Messiah, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god. He will utter monstrous blasphemies against the God of gods. He will prosper only until the period of the wrath is over, for what has been determined must take place. He will show no respect for the gods his ancestors worshipped or for the god women worshipped. Hold on to those two thoughts there in 37. He will show no respect for the gods his ancestors worked or for the god women worship. We're going to get into that a little bit. He won't show respect for any god because he will consider himself greater than all of them. Wow. The king here, again, is the coming false Messiah. Most scholars that have looked at this, both ancient scholars and really right up to modern times, have felt there's this really huge time gap between verses 35 and 36, and we can vouch for that because we're still in that gap. The prophecies of verses 2 through 35 end in 164 BCE. The prophecies from 36 on are about the false Messiah coming in those very last few years before the return of Messiah. And there are several reasons that that this is based on, this belief is based on, and we can believe on it. Number one, all of the prophecies from 2 to 35 have been fulfilled precisely as testified to by historical events. We keep harping on this, but I really want that point driven home. Number 2, there's nothing historical that corresponds exactly with the prophecies beginning in verse 36. In other words, we haven't seen any of this yet. It still hasn't happened. 3, the prophetic messages or passages in other parts of Scripture describing the false Messiah correspond very accurately with the description of the king, the false Messiah, that's being introduced here. Start of verse 36. Number 4, in chapter 12:1, as we're going to look at next week, it says, there will be a time of distress like has never occurred since there has been a nation. That nation being Israel, now in place. And Yeshua has indicated that this unique time of distress is going to occur just prior to his return. Again, let's go back to Matthew 24, this time verse 21, please. For there will be trouble then, worse than there has ever been from the beginning of the world until now. That's up to when he's speaking. And there will be nothing like it again. That's when it happens. It's going to be a one-time event. Indeed, if the length of this time had not been limited, no one would survive, but for the sake of those who have been chosen, its length will be limited. This hasn't occurred yet. Those really up there, those 4 that I've given you, are reasons for placing these last verses of the Revelation to Daniel at the end time. The prophecy here gives us insight into the character of the false Messiah. He's going to be an absolute dictator to those he controls. An absolute dictator to those he controls. He'll do as he pleases. Absolutely do as he pleases. Tolerate no restraints upon himself. Recognize no law, no authority higher than himself. Paul describes him in 2 Thessalonians 2, please, 2:3. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for the day will not come until after the apostasy has come, and the man who separates himself from Torah has been revealed, the one destined for doom. Way back in Daniel 7:25, we learned that this false Messiah intends to alter law. He will reject all forms of established law so that he can be the law. He will also blaspheme the true God. He will speak monstrous things of God to the point of astonishing people, the same as the little horn and the first beast of Revelation 13, 5, and 6 did. Let's actually go back to Daniel 7, 24 and 25 and read that, please. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and yet another will arise after them. He will be different from the earlier ones, and he will put down 3 kings. He will speak words against the Most High and try to exhaust the holy ones of the Most High. He will attempt to alter the seasons and the law, and the holy ones will be handed over to him for time, times, and a half time. Hang on to time, times, and a half time. Now, let's take this to Revelation 13, 5, and 6. It was given a mouth speaking arrogant blasphemies. This is speaking to the false Messiah again. It was given authority to act for 42 months. So it opened its mouth in blasphemies against God to insult his name, his Shekinah, that's his glory, and those living in heaven. Now, time, times, and a half times of Daniel are the same as the 42 months of Revelation. That's 3.5 years. That's half of that 70th week of Daniel, if you will. Once the false Messiah comes to power, he will be able to prosper until the period of wrath is finished, but only to that point. Only to that point. And this may well be the period of fury or God's indignation spoken of Daniel 8:19, Daniel 8:19 that we've already studied. Or it might just speak of those last 3.5 years that are taking place. In any case, it's until the end of the false Messiah's rule that we're looking at here. So let's look at this closely. Not only will the false Messiah be opposed to the true God, as stated here, he will show a total disregard for the gods of his ancestors, as indicated in Daniel 11:36 and 37 that we looked at just a bit ago. This would seem to indicate that since he's going to have a total disregard for his ancestors, that he will come from a religious background. What this religion could be or would be, we don't know. And he will show no regard for the God that women worship. And some believe that this is a direct reference to Messiah. He will show no regard for the God that women worship. And some believe that this is a direct reference to Messiah. So, how could that be? Well, let's take ourselves back to that particular time when Daniel's writing all of this down. At that point, and hundreds of years after Daniel, in pre-Messianic times prior to Yeshua, at the time Daniel was doing this and up until the time of Yeshua, one of the greatest desires of a Jewish woman was that she would be the mother of Messiah. She would be the mother of Messiah. If we understand that, that was the era that this was taking place in, then we can better understand this, the God that women worship, and probably better understand the statement of Miriam in the Hebrew about this. Let's go to Luke chapter 1, verse 46. Then Miriam said, "My soul magnifies Adonai, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior." There's both Messiah and God all lumped into one. "Who has taken notice of his servant girl in her humble position. For imagine it, from now on all generations will call me blessed. The Mighty One has done great things for me. Indeed, his name is holy." Miriam just been told by Gabriel that she is to be the mother of Messiah. That this great desire of all Jewish women is going to be fulfilled in her. And as soon as she got this information, she took off to see her cousin Elizabeth, who was pregnant with John the Baptist at that particular point. Look again at what she says up here. Then Miriam said, "My soul magnifies Adonai, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, who has taken notice of his servant girl in her humble position. For imagine it, from now on all generations will call me blessed. The Mighty One has done great things for me. Indeed, his name is holy." Wow. She's the one. Of all the Jewish women whose wish was to be honored as the mother of Messiah, she will be the one who is called blessed. If we think about this, this gives substance to the thought that the God that women worship is Messiah. The false Messiah will certainly have no regard for the real Messiah, who we know is also God. Plus, the false Messiah will oppose every object of worship that's present in his day. All of the icons, all of the false deities, everything that's worshipped, he will oppose in order to magnify himself above every god. He will oppose every form of established worship in order to clear the way for worship of himself. Daniel 11:38, please. "But instead he will honor the God of strongholds." Guess who that is? "With gold, silver, precious stones, and other costly things, he will honor a God unknown to his ancestors. He will deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god. He will confer honor on those he acknowledges, causing them to rule over many and distributing land as its reward." That last sentence is vastly important. This is speaking, this phrase in here in Daniel 11:38 and 39 is speaking of a final world religion. In addition to ascribing deity to himself, the false Messiah will have a theology. He will honor the God of strongholds or fortresses. This is pointing to Hasatan, to Satan. This God of his and himself, you could almost merge them into a single unit, will be peculiarly different from the gods that his father would have known, whatever they turn out to be. This God of the false Messiah will be an impersonal God who will make war on Adonai's holy ones. He will make war on anyone who won't worship him, actually. And the false Messiah will believe that this God, Satan, will give him the power to make war. He will be devoted to the conquest of the world. That's his goal at this point. The false Messiah will possibly deify war, make war itself into something to be worshipped. He will be completely materialistic, exalting human power and attainment. This will be characterized by warfare. He will honor his God by pouring out vast sums of wealth into the building of his military machine and waging of war. He'll be motivated to attack the strongest military installations, and as he conquers areas, he will reward his most ardent followers in two ways. And we're down to this last phrase in here on verse 39. First of all, he will give rulerships over large groups of people. Secondly, he will give gifts of choice land. The people receiving these gifts, this rulership and the land, this kind of power, will do so at the expense of their own souls, because they will be then totally in league with him. When we get to Revelation, we're going to talk about seals that people will have on their foreheads. Because of what they're doing, giving their total devotion to the false Messiah, their souls are gone. Now, Daniel 11:40 through 43 talks about the final war that erupts. When the time of the end comes, the king of the south will push at him, while the king of the north will attack him like a whirlwind with chariots, cavalry, and a large navy. He will invade countries, overrun them, and move on. He will also enter the land of glory, and many countries will come to grief, but these will be saved from his power. Look at that last line. Edom, Moab, and the people of Ammon will be saved from his power. For some reason, he won't take control of what's modern Jordan. Now, if we look at what's going on, he will reach out his hand to seize other countries too. The land of Egypt will not escape. He will control the treasures of gold and silver as well as everything else in Egypt of value. Put and Ethiopia will also be subject to him. These are other countries in Africa other than Egypt. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage the false Messiah in battle. That's what that opening statement that we looked at in verse 40 was all about. Why? Probably because he will be sucked up by the king of the north. The concept of the end of the time was first introduced way back in verse 35, is brought up again here in verse 40. It makes clear that a military struggle is going to characterize the end of the age. The general nature and location of this warfare is also specified. This one, mentioned all through verses 36 through 39, the false Messiah, is now attacked by the king of the south and the king of the north. King of the north picks up the king of the south as an ally. Previously, in the first 35 verses of our chapter, our preview, the kings of the south were the Ptolemies of Egypt, who were clearly leaders of the political and military force south of Israel. However, at this time, the future prophecy is talking about much more than Egypt. It's talking about Put and Ethiopia being added into this, maybe involving a great deal of Africa. Understand that right now, today, there is an African Union in place with a standing militia. It's one of these 10 kingdoms that the world is currently divided itself into. 10 of that 3 our scripture tells us, will be taken over by the false Messiah. So if he's going to take over Egypt and put in Ethiopia, it's talking about taking over at least a section of Africa. The king of the north was previously identified as the Seleucids of Greek Syria. This is now future prophecy, most probably involving a larger region with more political and military forces to the north of Israel than was talking about in Antiochus's times. Look at what's whacking Israel today out of Syria. All kinds of various groups, including Iran, and Turkey has just withdrawn its ambassador from Israel yesterday. I don't know if you're aware of that. But Turkey yesterday withdrew its ambassador from Israel. Somewhere in the end times, both forces from the south and from the north will attack the false Messiah militarily. The question always is, when will this happen? And a lot of people say, well, that's Armageddon. Well, I don't think so. Probably not. I think we're going to see as we progress through our study that this will most probably happen in the first half of the 70th week of Daniel. This allowing the false Messiah to become a hero in Israel. How does he gain such control over Israel? He does things to save their water, so to speak, that make him the hero. And the temple's on the Temple Mountain. He lets them start temple services again and all of this stuff. He becomes their hero. And Israel is almost going to worship him like a false god. Remember some of the stuff we've just looked at coming into play through him. But right now, let's look at a couple of things. Let's go back to Daniel 9:27, please. Daniel 9:27 says, he, that's the false Messiah, will make a strong covenant with leaders for 1 week of years. This is Daniel's 70th week. Remember, we've been talking about 69 weeks at the start of Daniel. This is the 70th week of Daniel. For half the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and the grain offering. On the wing of detestable things, the desolator will come and continue until the already decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. So here he is, the false Messiah. If this is a covenant between the leaders of Israel and the false Messiah, remember we talked about that as an option, and we discussed that this covenant will probably have a military aspect to it. The false Messiah in this covenant will say, an attack on Israel is an attack on me. You people to the north and you people to the south can't mess with Israel. If you do, you're messing with me, and they will. They will attack him. It's an attack on me and on my kingdom, which is a worldwide kingdom to some extent at this point. This attack then is probably occurring about the middle of the 7-year period, possibly a few months before the middle of the 7 years, but about in the middle. And this information in Daniel 9:27 and up here in Daniel 11:40 and 41 shows us a world-controlling power in the false Messiah. He is a world-controlling power. Attack from the kings, leaders of the north and the south. Then is a rebellion against the false Messiah by some of his Gentile princelings. This will be, I believe, some of the Islamic states unified together, defying him and their demonic-driven need to destroy Israel to the man. These Islamic states, both to the north and the south of Israel. We need to see this in the light of events of Antiochus Epiphanes being a foreshadow. What was going on in that now historical event of Antiochus Epiphanes, and what is going to be going on in the prophesied future event of the false Messiah that's been pictured for us. There was warfare going on that involved the kings of the north and the south, with Israel underfoot and a stronger power becoming involved. Rome, during the time of Antiochus. The king of the north and the king of the south, and Rome. Rome picturing again a stronger power, which is the beginning of the fourth Gentile empire of man. Now take this kind of as an overlay. When this warfare stops, Antiochus Epiphanes enters Jerusalem, stops the temple service. The abomination that causes desolation is placed on the temple, and Antiochus demands to be worshipped. That was a historical fact. That's the picture. Now we're being given a prophecy that says in the future there's going to be a warfare involving the kings of the north and the kings of the south against Israel, with a power becoming involved, a stronger power becoming involved. This is at the end of the fourth Gentile empire of man. When this warfare is over, this stronger power, this king, the false Messiah, will enter Jerusalem, stop the temple service, set up the abomination that causes desolation in the temple again, and this king or false Messiah will demand to be worshipped. What's going on in Israel right now today is a war between the God of Israel and the God of Islam. Never lose sight of the fact that this is spiritual warfare going on throughout the entirety of this. It's a spiritual warfare for control of the world. Remember what we just saw in verse 37? He, the false Messiah, won't show respect for any God because he will consider himself greater than any of them. Setting himself up in the temple, what does he show? He shows that in his own mind at least, that in this war that he will have just completed, he is superior to both the God of Israel and the God of Islam because he has the Temple Mount under his control and he didn't have to worship either of them to get it. He is the true God of the world. See how that generates? This will be, I think, at the 3.5-year mark, and he will have revealed himself. Some people think that because the greater attack seems to be indicated from the north, that the false Messiah will move into these areas first, then move south across Israel in order to get to North Africa. This was actually the path followed by Antiochus north to south as a foreshadow, and then to Jerusalem. In the false Messiah's haste to move south, the areas of Edom, Moab, and Ammon will be bypassed. Remember, we pointed that out earlier. Take note that this is largely modern Jordan today. It is also very possible that this is the place where Messiah said that his people can take refuge during this time. In Matthew 24:15 through 18 that we looked at. Get out of town real quick. Don't go back to pick anything up, but run. The false Messiah will move through Egypt, Libya, which is Put. Libya today was Put, and down to Ethiopia. This indicates who the rebellious countries in the south were. Now Daniel 11, verse 44, please. However, news from the east and the north will frighten him so that he moves out in great fury to ruin and completely do away with many. Finally, when he pitches the tents of his palace between the seas and the mountain of the holy glory, he will come to his end with no one to help him. There's one more battle that he's going to move out into. This to me was very interesting information. False Messiah is going to encounter more difficulties than just this invasion from the north and the south that he's been through. The rebellion that he's just put down. Probably as early as when he's mopping up in Africa, he's going to receive disturbing news from the east and from the north. Actually, a gigantic army from the east plus another force from the north is going to be rising up against him when we study this out. This new force from the north would lead us to believe that the first force from the north was local. maybe just Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, maybe Turkey. That would leave intact Russia as a force from the north. If that is the case, now Russia is coming, along with a strong force from the east. At least they're threatening to attack the false Messiah. This warfare apparently will extend over a period of time with more than just one battle involved. Let's look at a couple of places in the book of Revelation about a force from the east that would apply here. Revelation 9:12 through 16. The first woe has passed, but there are still 2 woes to come. The sixth angel sounded his shofar, and a voice from the 4 horns of the gold altar before God, saying to the sixth angel, the one with the shofar, release the 4 angels that are found at the great river Euphrates next. And they were released. These 4 angels had been kept ready for this moment, for this day and month, to kill 1/3 of mankind, and the number of cavalry soldiers was 200 million. I heard the number. Understand that this 1/3 that is talking about being killed here takes place, as we're going to find out as we continue our study, after 1/4 of the world has already been depopulated, leaving 3/4 of the world. So another 1/3 of the world being taken out would be the earth's reduced to just half its population. When this occurs, it's going to be turning loose who is beyond the Euphrates. Let's look at Revelation 16:12, please. The sixth one poured out his bowl on the river Euphrates, and its water dried up in order to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Who is beyond the Euphrates to the east? Iran. Iran. This prophecy of another invasion against the false Messiah from the east and the north is most likely given to us best information in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Russia from the north with its allies mentioned in Ezekiel 38:6 and 15 and Ezekiel 39:2. And one of Russia's allies, Iran, ancient Persia, is from the east, Ezekiel 38:5. That's a possibility for the wars of Daniel 11:44. One thing is certain, though. It's not going to be just one battle. It's going to be a series of battles. 1/3 of the world's population is going to die. 1/3 of the remaining world's population is going to die. The false Messiah will launch a counterattack to ruin and do away with many. I want to back out of this war business for a few minutes, because it says he, the false Messiah, will succeed in establishing his royal place between the 2 seas. Probably when all this fighting is going on, and probably the reason that the abomination that causes desolation, the statue of himself, will be set up so that he can be worshipped while he's out fighting all the rest of these battles. He will succeed in establishing his place between the 2 seas, Daniel 10:44. Where is the mountain of glory located? Between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. It's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In the process of establishing himself there, the false Messiah will fight this series of wars. While those wars are going on, he's going to be establishing himself, and the temple is the one to be worshipped. This is all going to be happening kind of simultaneously. False Messiah will fight this series of wars, huge wars, and the collateral damage among civilians fantastically high. We've just seen those figures with weapons of mass destruction involved, probably nukes. And always when you have widespread war, there's widespread famine and pestilence that adds to the destructive factor. It's easy, I believe, to see how 1/4 and then 1/3 of the world's remaining population could go away. Now, This is telling us that the false Messiah's headquarters will literally be built on Mount Zion, literally on the mountain of glory. This is going to be the temple that he's going to take over to be worshipped as the God in residence in that temple. This is the mountains where the temples of God have always stood. It is between the Mediterranean and the Dead Seas. This is where Yeshua is going to come back, but you see, he's there in his mind to replace Yeshua. This place will be the headquarters for the false Messiah at this time, and how better to be in God's face than to take this step on his part. Next book of the Bible that we're going to look at in our study is in Zechariah. And it's interesting what is said in Zechariah 14 about this. Zechariah 14, 1 through 4, please. Look, a day is coming for Adonai when your plundered Jerusalem will be divided right there within you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for war. The city will be taken, the houses will be rifled, the women will be raped, and half the city will go into exile. Where's that half the city going into exile from? From the false Messiah, probably to Jordan. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Next. Then Adonai will go out and fight. Whoops, we've changed something right here in midstream at verse. We've come to the end of the false Messiah through the return of the Messiah. Then the Messiah will go out and fight against those nations. Fighting is on the day of battle. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies to the east of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives will be split in half from east to west to make a huge valley. Half of the mountain will move towards the north, and half of it towards the south. This is speaking of the very time that Messiah returns to the earth. Speaking of when the nations of the earth are coming against Jerusalem. And if we think about it, why would it be necessary for the nations of the world to come against Jerusalem? Even the military of Israel doesn't warrant all the nations of the world massing to attack it. Why all these powerful armies? Why all these great battles? Why all these high casualties? The false Messiah, ruler of the world, is going to be headquartered in Jerusalem. His end will come with no one to help him. The city will be taken, the houses rifled, the women will be raped, half the city will go into exile. Possibly that area of Jordan that the false Messiah can't control. At that point, and we'll look at this in great detail when we get to the Olivet Discourse, at this point, what's left in Israel and Jerusalem is going to cry out for Messiah to return. It is prophesied that is what must happen before he will come back. Then Messiah will come and fight against those nations. This then will be the return of Messiah to rule the world. Like I just mentioned, we're going to expand on this when we look at the time of the Yeshua speaking on the Mount of Olives, and we're also going to expand on this when we get into Zechariah in the next couple of weeks. We looked earlier that during this last 7 years of Daniel's 70 weeks, this last 70 days of his final 70th week, that the false Messiah would claim to be God. He will set up an abomination of desolation at a temple in Jerusalem. At this time he will break his covenant with Israel, persecute them during the final 3.5 years. But in spite of the fact that he will have great power given to him by Satan, Hasatan, and be energized supernaturally by Satan, by Hasatan, his time will be limited. 2 Thessalonians again, chapter 2, verse 9. When this man who avoids Torah comes, the adversary, Satan, Hasatan, will give him the power to work all kinds of false miracles, signs, and wonders. You know what? The coming of the lawless one, the false Messiah, will be in accordance with the works of Satan, displaying all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and prophets. And it's hardly going to do him a bit of good because it's not going to last long. Daniel 11:45 says he will come to his end, and no one will be able to help him. no one will be able to deliver him from the judgment of God. I want to conclude our lesson tonight with where the false Messiah is going to end up laid out for us. Revelation 19, verse 19. I saw the beast, the false Messiah, and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to do battle with the rider on the horse and his army. That's the rider on the white horse returning Messiah. But the beast, false Messiah, was taken captive, and with it the false prophet who in his presence had done the miracles which he had used to deceive those who had received the mark of the beast and those who had worshipped his image. Next, the beast and the false prophet were both thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. The rest were killed with the sword that goes out of the mouth of the rider of the horse, and all the birds gorged themselves on their flesh. Then let's look at Revelation 20, verse 10. The adversary who had deceived them was hurled into the lake of sulfur. The adversary, Satan, along with the false Messiah and all with him, hurled into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast, false Messiah, and the false prophet were. And they will be tormented day and night, forever and ever. We'll close with that. Next week we're going to get into Daniel chapter 12, and we will finish our study of Daniel with that. Now again, the Lord tossed a whole bunch of stuff at us, but everybody follow that pretty close. It really lays out all the stuff that's going to happen, and we know from going through the earlier parts of Daniel chapter 11 that everything that God has said is absolutely going to happen. It's absolutely going to happen.